Well, thank you, Dale. I'm both overjoyed and humbled to be here. Um, Bill always talked about spaces, something which you felt when you began to talk, and I had kind of an image of what it might be like to be here, but for some reason I hadn't focused it was going to be in this room at Yale Divinity, where I've spent many hours. I was also a graduate of not the Divinity School, but of the graduate program in religious studies and also Middle East studies at Yale. But one of my favorite teachers was a member of the Yale Divinity faculty, Norman Hine. Norman J. Hine, who I think is now 99 years old. So it puts all the rest of our age in perspective, I think, you know. But Norman used to say there's something very meditative about this room. And so he encouraged me whenever I had a really difficult assignment. He said, go to the missions room. He said, it kind of takes you out of yourself. And I sort of feel a little bit disembodied or maybe re-embodied in my mind-body as I think about being in this space where I have not been in 43 years. So it's an interesting return to come here, and thanks to Dale and thanks to everybody. I'm really sorry, actually, that Betty Eidner and also Jerry Eidner, her husband, are not here, along with Betty Wolf, I should mention. We all have many sides, but the other side of me, besides being a professor who taught at Duke, I also taught at, for briefer times at Chicago, Oxford, and Dartmouth, and now I'm teaching in Istanbul every fall. But Duke has essentially been my home for, you know, over 40 years. But I'm also an Episcopal clergyman. We've had some discussions about whether I'm Episcopal or Anglican, and I always reassure people that I'm an Episcopalian because my youngest brother's gay. And I married him. I did the service for him. So, you know, please don't ever confuse me of being an Anglican. I'm an Episcopal minister. And we can talk more about that. And Bill and I shared a lot of things about the Episcopal side, which will come out maybe in the anecdotes later on. But I just want to say at the outset that Bill welcomed me not only when I became a junior professor at Duke in 1971, but he also said, we pay you poverty wages. And he was right. My starting salary at Duke was $11,100. And I was married, had 5 children, and my wife was not working. So it was a tight budget. And Bill said, you know, you also have this other shingle as an Episcopal minister. And I have this friend, Lonnie London. He's a librarian at UNC. You've heard about Bill and being at UNC and Duke. And many people never get through that ratcheting of Bill as UNC and Duke. But I was really glad he had the UNC connection because he knew Lonnie London, and Lonnie London's brother lived in Pittsburgh and was a senior warden of Episcopal Church that needed not an interim, they used to call it just a Sunday visitor, somebody who would go out there and, you know, preach and get paid money, which is what I did it for. And so thanks to Bill's connections in UNC and the larger community, I was able to afford to stay at Duke and to still be poor, but surviving and really enjoying life much more because of Bill. So I'm going to say some things today that are more reflective of my larger engagement with Bill. And I really, before I start, want to thank Dale for not only inviting me, but encouraging me to suggest that I really could stand forth here on the first day. And when I read some of the people participating and knew something about their connections with Bill, I was not only humbled, I was a little bit overawed at the prospect that I was going to be starting this gathering and with the question, who was William H. Poteat and what was he about? So some of you have already read and some of you have already commented, mostly appreciatively about what I've said, but some of the rest of you may not. And I'm also going to ad lib. There are some things that I feel, well, just to repeat what's already been said, those of us who came yesterday had the privilege of seeing the papers, or at least beginning to look through some of the papers that are gathered here. And as though I thought I knew a little bit about Bill, and I do know maybe a thimbleful about him, I feel it expanded to a cup. And the cup overflowed yesterday with all the different reflections. And I'm going to particularly mention one of his letters to you, Milton. But there are several others that just jumped out at me. And I said, my gosh, I knew and I appreciated and loved a lot about the man, but there are whole angles and vistas of his personality that, to me at least, only became a little bit clearer and even more playful and attractive through some of these letters that we saw yesterday. So I'm going to make some reference to those letters in the remarks that I make. So let me begin by identifying who I am, or at least who I believe I have become in 2014. As I told you, I'm a Yale graduate. I graduated from Yale with a joint degree in both religious studies and Middle East in 1972. And I was hired in the religion department by Tom Langford, Bill's colleague and collaborator. But I should say I was hired at Duke without a job offer. I mean, there was no job advertised. And I was at my very first conference was actually where I was still very much into theology in those days. I gave a paper on the unknown Christ of Hinduism. It doesn't really matter, but it was sort of some of the things I was speculating about then. And Tom Langford was in the audience, and he kept me and said, "Have you thought about teaching at Duke?" And I said, "I may have thought about it, but there's no position." He said, "Yes, there is. I just created it." So that was my first introduction to Duke. It's a place that can ad-lib and improvise. And of course, he did create a position, and I took it. And that's why I'm at Duke, and that's how I got to know Bill. So just that as a background.
Would you like a position here? Because we can do that.
Well, I think actually that happened in 1983. I was a finalist for a job in religious studies at Duke in 83, and then I realized that you can go home, but it's not always the same place you left, and so I stayed at Duke. But anyway, the edited book that Bill and Tom did, Intellect and Hope, which came out from Duke in '68, and all of you know about it, it was the only book of Bill's actually that I'd read before Dale invited me to this awesome task that I'll try to discharge today, asking and then providing signposts, flags, if you will, forward arrows, to answer this double query: who was William H. Poteat, and what was he about? So Dale was a planner, and he probed and prompted and finally convinced me to take this assignment more than 6 months ago. And so I began thinking, you know, I better begin reading again. I better begin reading about Bill. And I did. And I think in the past 6 months, I've thought more about William H. Poteat than I had in the preceding 14 years. And why do I say 14 years? Because the other assignment I had, the other relationship among many I had with Bill, was I was chair of the Department of Religion in May 2000, and so I had to organize the memorial service for Bill after his death. So I also had that other connection with him. And I think I saw some of you. In fact, I'm really sure when we had our little meeting at Maury's last night, I said, "Gee, I recognize some of these faces." They said, "Oh yeah, I saw you at the funeral." So some people here whom I have not met, I have seen, and we kind of recognized each other because of that event that took place in the Duke Chapel back in May of 2000. As I said, it was a grand event. It was held in the Duke Chapel. There were hundreds in attendance, many of them former students of Bill, all warm admirers who also were keen inquirers into the issues that engaged Bill during a long, productive lifetime of reflection, teaching, and advocacy. I have a footnote which I hesitate to share, but I think I should do it because Dale and I had conversations about this. As someone who's not a member of the Polanyi Society and not known all the traffic, intellectual and personal, that went on through the pages of the Polanyi Society publications, I had never read Bob Osborne's essay about Bill. But Dale asked me, as somebody who was a colleague and not an expert, as you may have already guessed, on anything to do with either Polanyi or Bill Poteat as scholars, he asked me if I'd read it. And I must say, I was just dismayed. I mean, I reread it, and I said, I don't understand whom he's talking about. For those of you who don't know it, it's an essay that was done in the Polanyi Society. What was it, back in 19?
It was actually given as he was a member of a panel that we put together at the Polanyi Loyola conference.
What year was that?
What year was that? 2012.
2012. So fairly recent, and Bob has been retired for several years. For those of you who don't know, Bob Osborne also was Bill's successor as chair of religion at Duke. So Bill was chair, and then there were several others before I became chair in 1998. So I know both Bob and Bill, but Bob much less well than I knew Bill. But when I read this essay, I was really dismayed, but also disappointed at what to me was the narrow reading that Bob had of Bill. And the key phrase in that reading was, this is Bob speaking on behalf of all the colleagues, which is why I'm now citing it, because I consider myself in that we. So I have to respond to maybe you, but not me, to the we that he's putting out there. And I'm not a hip hopper, but that's the way it goes. The key phrase is, we did not know that he was very troubled by the subject-object dichotomy and the disembodied egocentrism of Cartesianism. Now, to me, this statement is really startling because had I talked with Bill for only 5 minutes, I would have known there was something was up about the mind-body split. And I think it's a small leap, even for a theologian, from there to the subject-object dichotomy that Bob mentions. But perhaps more astonishing to me is Bob Osborne's self-confession, which quickly follows on this declaration that he was innocent of Bill's critique of Cartesianism. I am, after all, he says, an inveterate theologian, hardly a philosopher. And then he goes on to say, my theologian is Karl Barth, and in this connection I am reminded of a passage in Barth where he speaks of the all too triumphal overcoming of the subject and object dichotomy. And I'm told, or at least it's there in this published version of the talk, that the audience who first heard that quip laughed, but when I read it, I grimaced, because I thought, can anyone who is a theologian be unaware, I did study, as I said, theology at one point, can anyone who's a theologian be unaware of Barth's aversion to subject-object discourse? So I expect there's something deeper afoot in Bob Osborne's protestations and denials, as also his caricature of Bill as a non-colleague. He was a colleague, but someone who was always absent, or an absent presence in Bob's mind. What characterized Bill, in my view, was a constant probing, not settling for scriptural citations or theological platitudes, but looking at the inner dis-ease, not dis-ease, but dis-ease, dis-ease of ecumenism. In his later writings, Bill defines ecumenism, and I cite this a bit later in my own reflections, as a reflex that gravitates towards seeing its object as a finite totality. That didn't mean he was anti-ecumenical, but he believed that thinking of putting together groups in a kind of, if you will, gross sense of ecumenism was something that objectified rather than subjectivized the audiences being described. So this is just one short stop of what also is just in Recovering the Ground is called Bill calls ontological monism, itself a kind of reductionism, but also ironically a dimension of Barthian Christology, as noted by no less a person than John Cobb, when he dubbed the thunderous accent on Christ in Barthian writings as itself a form of Christomonism. Barth later denied that labeling of his method and outlook, in other words, Barth never admitted and never agreed to being described as a Christomonist, but some Barthians, including Bob Osborne, still seem to advocate a kind of Christomonism. And the critique of Bill and Bob's essay finally, in my view, says more about Bob and his dispositions than it does about Bill. And Bill, for me, remains a triple treasure, rigorous scholar, zestful teacher, and also generous colleague. So what follows, I will try, modestly, to make some effort to evoke this treasured friend and former colleague who is above all, and this is my description of Bill, may not be yours, a devout disciple of mind-body coherence. Let me be clear. I'll not directly engage what Bill derived from or debated with Michael Polanyi. There are others here who both knew Bill and Michael as philosophers and also as friends, and they will elaborate and refine how those of us at the margins, and I put myself very much at the margins here, how we think of the Polanyi-Poteat continuum, and also obviously points of departure one from the other. I will instead look at other resources that guided or provoked Bill's reflection, but first let me summarize what I take to be the nub of Bill's lifelong project. And this is after my reading and rereading, and thanks to Dale's provocation, looking again at many of the things that Bill published after he had retired, which he did. He retired from Duke in 1987. So Bill's own reflection, that is his turning inward and gazing outward at the same time, his rigorous fixation on exploring mind-body as an irreducible interactive unit, or in other words, I would say that his quest was to search for the radix is his term, radix of all meaning and all meaning discernment, namely the tonic and ductile mind-body ingenuously dwelling in its world. Now, I can't read that once and parse it, so I have to read it twice. And perhaps the rest of you who already get it will not mind hearing it again. So my own sense of Bill's lifelong project was to understand the radix of all meaning and all meaning discernment. What does that mean? Namely, the tonic and ductile mind-body ingenuously dwelling in its world. I'm grateful to Diane Yeager, whom it turns out I knew but didn't really have a chance to meet and enjoy a conversation with until yesterday. I'm grateful to Diane Yeager for signaling in the preview of her own address, which we'll hear later, where she will survey how Bill engaged key critics of modern culture. When I think of the range of whom he read and with whom he interacted, they sort out to me in two overlapping but still discreetly separate lists. They're first the philosophers and cultural critics, obviously Polanyi, but in addition Pascal, the critic and opposite of what I call the animus horribilis, Descartes, of whom more later, and obviously H. Richard Niebuhr, who was one of his teachers here at Yale, as also teacher of Stanley Hauerwas, Soren Kierkegaard, obviously the person often referred to as L.W., otherwise known as Ludwig Wittgenstein, Merleau-Ponty, Hannah Arendt, and Paul Ricoeur, just to cite a few. But then, what makes this such a generous and capacious offering is writers and poets. We've already heard about W.H. Auden, but also Albert Camus, Elizabeth Sewell, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, and of course, Walker Percy. So I want to begin in my reflections where Bill begins in one of his many book reviews. I found this an absolutely fascinating book review, and some of you may have found it less fascinating, but I still thought it was extremely interesting that one of the books that he reviewed, he was not only an ardent reader, but a trenchant critic of much of what he read. I've forgotten whom. I've talked to a lot of people in the last 24 hours, but somebody said, Bill never read a book for what it said. He read a book to see how it made him think. So it wasn't the content of the book, it was the style of the argument that drew him in and from which he derived some benefit. And I think, I never heard that remark, obviously, before last night. Someone who knows Bill far better than I made it to me, but I thought, oh, that's exactly what happened when he read Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemy. So I think almost all you know Popper. He was an Austrian-British philosopher, and Bill did this review in 1954 of the book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, that had been published almost 10 years earlier in 1945. So this is a review well after the fact, after a lot of people have read and responded to The Open Society and Its Enemies. Bill writes this kind of meta-review, if I can coin a term. So it's a meta-review looking at both the book, its impact, and then a decade later, a reassessment. Like all of Bill's arguments, whether oral or written, his review of Popper's influential work, to me, demonstrates both Bill's capacious intellect, but also his fierce loyalty to ontology, the science of being. So he begins by praising Popper, which is fitting, I think. He said, it's now only slightly less than 10 years since the appearance of the first edition of Karl R. Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. A book written in a time of crisis, so passionate in its moral indignation, so substantial in its attack upon basic questions in the philosophy of social sciences, so knowledgeable in its command of scholarship of ancient modern philosophies, and so trenchant in the questions it poses, pause, that only now have the criticisms demanded by so earnest and fundamental a work begun to appear. And from that opening gambit, through 14 pages, I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry, spare yourselves, wake up again. Through 14 pages of densely argued engagement with the major theses of Popper's signature book, Bill asked the question that cuts to the core of Popper's theoretical frame. And this is the question he puts at the end. Does not a principle of criticism have to point beyond itself to a reality upon which it itself depends, yet cannot be simply grasped? And if so, can an open society long survive that points only to itself or only to its critical principle and not beyond itself to this reality? That's his critique of both the book and the assessment. So Bill, never failing to appreciate even his flawed subject's intrinsic humanity, rounds out this robust critique of the absent reality in open society with an accolade for having forced us to raise these questions. We are in the debt of Karl R. Popper. And we can be grateful that the open society has so passionate, even if slightly ambivalent, an advocate. So it's kind of wonderful the way in which he says, you know, here really is a great book, but watch out. That ambivalent shadow still has to be assessed. What redeems Popper for Bill and for others is Popper's ability to anticipate some of the same mind-body issues that occupy the spectrum of anti-Cartesian skeptics among humanists, whether philosophies/theologians or poets and writers. In a later work, I'm not a Popperist, but I happen to have read quite a bit of Popper, so I was fascinated to read this review. In a later work titled Objective Knowledge, an Evolutionary Approach, published in 1972, Popper asserts, Western philosophy consists very largely of world pictures which are variations of the mind-body dualism and of problems of the method connected with them. The many departures from this Western dualistic theme were attempts to replace it by some kind of monism. And this goes back to Bob Osborne and the critique of Barth. Popper goes on to observe, it seems to me that these attempts to get beyond the mind-body dualism have been unsuccessful, and that behind the veil of monistic protestations, there still lurks the dualism of body and mind. So one claims to get beyond it through various kinds of monistic arguments and theses, but in the end, the dualism of body and mind is lurking. It was a Cartesian mind-body problem that occupied Bill even before he encountered Polanyi, in my mind, before he encountered Polanyi and later, of course, Moustakas. Bill has provided us with his intellectual personal journey, at least as I understand it, in the prologue to Polanyian Meditations, where, looking back at his doctoral dissertation, Pascal's Conception of Man and Modern Sensibility, Bill writes, and I found this just an extraordinary, I think I could have given my whole talk and meditation almost on this one passage of Bill's writing. I entered the 17th century cockpit. So you already know what's happened. This is going to be a fight for survival. That's what usually happens in a cockpit. I entered the 17th century cockpit from which modernity had emerged and opposed two of its great and characteristic thinkers, Pascal and Descartes. You know, I know he studied Greek, but this is Roman gladiators. This is Roman gladiator stuff coming out. These two equally modern men were opposed to one another in their conception of human reason. And then the kind of trenchant but also playful way that Bill talks about their differences. In Pascal's own formula, Descartes was the advocate of esprit de géométrique, the geometrical spirit, to translate literally the French. Esprit de géométrique, that sounds a little better in French. While Pascal, himself a great mathematician, embracing the former, wished also to uncover less explicit rational powers in man, which he called esprit de finesse, which is almost untranslatable. Esprit de finesse is kind of the spirit of ambience, of ambiguity. It's not finesse. It's not, having a good shot in the tennis court, which Bill also could do, by the way. I don't think that's the esprit de finesse he means here. Here he goes on to say, in the contrast between Pascal and Descartes, between esprit de géométrie, esprit de finesse, here was shaped for me the problem that has occupied me now for more than 30 years. The nature of rationality and logic in an intellectual climate where Descartes' legacies have prevailed and left us culturally insane. But could less explicit rational powers, which he says is what Pascal was able to unveil, could less explicit rational powers rescue us from the domain of what Bill calls the culturally insane? To me, that is a central query of Bill's life, how to find these less explicit rational powers, if not rescue us, at least give us some pause and perch outside the domain of the culturally insane. And again, I'm not a hip hopper. I didn't realize those things rhyme, domain of the culturally insane, but there we have it. To it, I would like to add another prologue, one that looks at the cleavage between natural theology and natural science. And here I'm going to cite someone who's one of my heroes, somebody I've never met but read a lot about, and that's Stephen Toulmin. This cleavage between natural theology and natural science, where Descartes played a central role. To me, it's illumined by an academic voyager, a fellow traveler whom, and I would welcome having some of you correct me, but in what I've seen, I haven't obviously read all the letters here and correspondence, but I have read most of what I've been able to get hold of Bill's own published writings. I've not seen Toulmin extensively cited in Bill's writings or in commentaries on his writings, but please correct me in the Q&A or later where I've missed it. But to me, that parallel anti-Cartesian philosopher who illuminates something of Bill's own project is Stephen Toulmin, a British philosopher also riveted by the seeming paradox, which he also calls the simmering poison of modernity. Like Bill, as also Polanyi and others, Tillman saw the linchpin for the downside of modernity in the thought and influence of Descartes. Descartes himself, in Tillman's words, or quoting from Return to Cosmology, Descartes himself was part of the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century that signaled the demise, in Tillman's words, of the very unity, order, and sense of proportion, all qualities embraced in the classical Greek term cosmos. Unity, order, sense of proportion, qualities in the classical Greek term cosmos that philosophers of antiquity had insisted must be retained. For Descartes, it was not science that triumphed, but a certain kind of science. The poison cup of Cartesian logic was no more evident than in Descartes' use of the science of geometry, hence Bill's play on the esprit géométrique. Linking it to a vector of power, this is Tillman now, he also made a disposition to empire. And this again, is, I think, is, in my own work, is a really helpful link to some of the things that I understand about how Cartesian logic also applies to the West is the best and the East is the least. Again, I'm not a hip hopper, but those are the things that people talk
Why
about.
deny it?
Actually, I have just come, as some of you know, from lower part of Connecticut. I have a younger brother who made the mistake of going to Andover and Yale, but he insisted that I stay with him, and he said, you spent all your time studying the East, but the West is the best. So I just heard this last night. So, this is a family argument. By the way, my brother's only 2 years younger than I, so I'm 73. We've been having this argument for at least 50 years. But I would still say the West is not the best. It has some qualities that maybe exceptionalize it, but I would never say the East is the least, because there are many parts of the East that I think are very informative, obviously, for Bill. I would call Greece as much part of the East as it is the West, and so try and decouple rather than reinscribe that dyad. But if we link this to a vector of power, as Tillman does, from the very start, he explains in Return to Cosmology, Descartes' philosophical program had imperial ambitions. This to me is extremely interesting. Descartes' philosophical program had imperial ambitions. As Descartes saw it, our understanding of geometry, what Bill refers to as esprit de géométrique, is not just one sort of understanding among others, it's intrinsically superior to all other sorts of knowledge. So it's not just one way of knowing, it's the best way of knowing. It provides a model to which other branches of learning should aspire to the extent that their basic concepts can approach the clarity and distinctiveness of the basic geometrical ideas and axioms. The resulting program for natural philosophy elevated sciences like physics, which are concerned with universal general phenomena, to a higher level of respect and recognition than those other branches of learning that deal with particular time-bound individuals and events. So for Descartes, and this is to me, of course, really hits somewhere below the heart and above the belt, but just deeply in the plexus, the study of history for Descartes was an intellectually shallow enterprise. So, that sort of lays the groundwork for a lot of what animated Bill. And then just one more final thing from Tillman. What really set Descartes apart from his predecessors, according to Tillman, in charting the philosophy of science, was his insistence not only there was objectivity, but a very special kind of objectivity. Descartes argued, this is Tillman again, Return to Cosmology, the end of the book when he sums up all of his argument and evidence. Descartes argued that the objectivity, which is also the universality of mathematical physics and similar science, makes their kinds of knowledge more basic, more scientific, and more rational. So that's the trilogy of affirmation for a hierarchy that's better than others. Basic, scientific, rational. So our knowledge of individual persons or agents, by contrast, that is the stuff of history or the mind-body knowledge that occupied Polanyi and also Bill, this kind of knowledge of individual persons or agents can never be generalized or universalized more geometrico. Now we're getting into Italian, in the manner of geometry, in a geometrical mindset, let's say, in more geometry, in a way of thinking geometrically. It can never be generalized or universalized geometrically thinking, and is therefore superficial, unscientific, and subjective. So this sets out, I think, in pretty categorical terms, the problem for Tillman, which I think is also the problem that Bill faced. And one last thing from Tillman, where he's gone through this, and he says, all of you may think this is just sort of another person bashing Descartes, but let me say, and this is the end of Tillman, and I'll move on to others, Cartesian commitment to the intellectual superiority of objective, universalizable knowledge has shaped much subsequent development of natural sciences. Even today, it remains strongly influential. And here's the example he gives, which to me is fascinating because I'm both an admirer and also a critic of this person he cites. For instance, in Noam Chomsky's scorn for anthropological linguistics, which he regards as intellectually shallow by comparison with general theories of transformational grammar, which has a geometrical model. And in those bitter methodological rivalries over respective claims of scientific objectivity and personal understanding, which split and sometimes destroy departments of psychology in American universities. And I won't get into psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I do know a lot of people in psychology at Duke, and you could map what's happened at Duke. I suspect it may also be true at Yale. I know it's true at Chicago. I've also, as I say, taught at Chicago. So I could give anecdotal evidence to say this is true, that there is a split between what is subjective and objective, what is verifiable and what is slippery or ambiguous knowledge, even and especially within psychology. The overarching, pervasive, consequential interrelatedness of things and thoughts has been ignored by the Cartesian method, according to Bill, and obviously also, of course, Tillman and others. It requires an alternative method and outlook, and it's the construction, advocacy, implementation of a mind-body disposition that, in my view, Bill Poteat dedicated his own labor in and beyond the walls of academia. So this is my strong statement of my understanding of Bill. He wants to construct, to advocate, and implement a mind-body disposition in, but also beyond the walls of academia. And I'll come later at the end of my comments to a glorious letter. I think he had, no, I'm not sure he addressed it to Milton. He may have addressed it to Beth. Anyway, it's, whoever got the letter will recognize that I'm quoting or misquoting Bill because I got a copy of it, yeah, right here. So I'll quote that later where he really says some pretty severe things about academia, but I'll save that for the second part. So many of the ways that Bill has taken his critique of the Cartesian mantra, then expanded it in new directions that I would be bereft of his other dominant trait, generosity, which is the soft side of his incisive logic. So let me just give you one example of what I think of as Bill as both searing in his critiques, but also gentle in his application of those to people who embody those critiques. And that one critique I'm going to look at is body language. And obviously I'm trying to gesture to give my own body language of why this is so important for Bill. And I'm glad this is all being pictured so you can see that I'm trying to articulate what I can't say by how I gesture. Because, by the way, I'm going to come to gesture. It's body language that provides the basis for Bill's critique of Walter Ong. Somebody else I could talk about in my own engagement with Ong, but that's another story. Body language provides the basis for Bill's critique of Walter Ong, even while appreciating Ong's accent on orality as a parallel and occasional superior to literacy in human self-expression. Grating to Bill was Ong's aphorism. By the way, I haven't had a chance to read, but I am extremely grateful for one of the papers that's going to come later, Mining's Collage in Context, which gives a lot of kind of one-liners, aphorisms from Bill at the end. And I read these and said, you know, sometimes it maybe is better when you have a really profound thinker to just take a meditative phrase, a koan, something that's haiku, and look at that instead of trying to look at the whole argument. So I'm really grateful for this paper that was handed out to us earlier today. Circling back to the aphorism in the final chapter, this aphorism, speech exists only when it's passing out of existence. Circling back to it in the final chapter of Polanyi Meditations, Bill picks up not just speech but gesture as instruments for registering, then evaluating the power of speech to persist in all phases of human being. Human being. There is, observes Bill, a latent logos common to my gesturing and speaking that is archaically rooted in my mind body. Though only recently discovered by social scientists, the gestural language is well known to all child psychologists, as also to astute observers of the mind-body language of philosophical debate. In probably the most condensed but poignant of all Bill's anecdotes, at least that I have read, he describes an incident, probably familiar to many of you, involving Wittgenstein and a Cambridge colleague, the Italian economist Piero Sraffa. Norman Malcolm had already noted this incident in his 1981 biography of Wittgenstein, but in that, if you've read it, actually I did also went back and reread it, he sloughs it off as just kind of a rude gesture. But Bill revisits it with attention to the mind-body convergence of gesturing and speaking. And here, one must almost conjure Bill speaking the following passages, and I'll try and read this in a Poteatian manner. When Piero Sraffa, having read the Tractatus, this is Wittgenstein's great work in the initial period, early Wittgenstein, when Piero Sraffa, having read the Tractatus, placed the back of his hand under his chin and gave a sharp outward stroke in a familiar Italian gesture, and asked his friend Wittgenstein, and what is the logical form of that? His integral speech act, and Bill italicized this phrase, so let me repeat it. His integral speech act, bodied forth words and bodied forth gesture, was of such precision, economy, nuance, and power as at a stroke to put the whole of his friend's early work in question. I mean, can you hear Bill announcing this? The larger point, of course, is that speech embodies power, even, especially when it's registered with bodily acts and not merely when, as Ong argues, it is passing out of existence. Bill is careful to note that Ong is trying to distinguish between spoken and printed, and so in his case, the passing out of existence refers only to speech and its power to articulate sound versus perhaps his persuasion as silent or printed word. But here is where Bill's logic prevents him from being, I put this in quotation marks, the perfect gentleman, even to his sympathetic adversaries. He may have been from North Carolina, but he wasn't always a Southern gentleman. He goes on to note that Ong opens up other dualisms, cleavages of the mind-body, when he implies, and this is a quote that I made earlier from Ong, speech does not leave a discernible effect in space. That is to say, it passes out of existence when it's recorded. We see, argues Bill, in closing the final chapter of the Polanyi Meditations, if we look more closely at Ong's dictum, we see, and this to me is one of the Poteatian phrases that just lingers and invites longer and more thoughtful consideration. We have, when we look at this dictum from Ong, says Bill, in the closing chapter of Polanyi Meditations, we see a veritable Cartesian mare's nest. A veritable Cartesian mare's nest. Not Ong's, not only Ong's, but our own, our culture's. And it is not innocent, nor is it benign. It risks, Bill goes on to say, increasing and perpetuating, again this phrase, our cultural insanity. This Cartesian mare's nest risks increasing and perpetuating our cultural insanity. And the significance of the metaphor will not be lost on the careful reader. Mare's nest, like Descartes and his logic, is a phrase that derives from the 17th century. Mare's nest may be defined as, this is quoting one dictionary, a much vaunted discovery which later turns out to be illusory or worthless, unquote. Since mares don't make nests, the phrase is supposed to be comically ironic, as in the following two quotes. John Fletcher in the Jacobean Tragedy of Bonduca, produced in 1613. Why dost thou laugh? What mare's nest hast thou found? That's supposed to be funny. And then in the 18th century, I have to prompt you to laugh. The next one, I won't need to prompt you. And then in the 18th century, Jonathan Swift pushed the absurd even further in the play Miscellanies 1751. His character exclaims, "What? Have you found a mare's nest and laugh at the eggs?" It is the mare's Cartesian eggs that are still exported from the farm of modernity. And those who cry out for a postmodern paradise must first attend to the modern Cartesian desert or wasteland, echoing obviously Eliot, bereft of real eggs. Fortunately, we have the clarion cry of Bill Poteat to guide us through the treacherous byways and thought waves in contemporary Euro-American culture and to attempt to regain our sanity. So here are some of my, I want to end this at 11, so let me just give you my second half, what I call part two. Part two was part one was trying at least to say who is or who was Bill Poteat, and then the second part, what was he about? And when you add that qualifier, the preposition, what was he about, it seems to me you have to dig at another level. So this is, if part one is kind of the initial flourish of all my first responses to Bill, thanks to the assignment that I was given by Dale to lead off this wonderful gathering, this is sort of an attempt to go at a little different level and look at what Bill was about rather than what Bill was. So all the things I cited above, the commentaries, the arguments, counter-arguments, even the humor, barely touch the surface of what William Poteat was all about. To dive beneath the surface and begin to engage the contours of his project, what he was all about, One has to look, in my view, at later writings, and obviously I now know also one needs to spend time at Yale looking at these archive papers. So I read, really for the first time, the Philosophical Daybook and Recovering the Ground, and I found the second, Recovering the Ground, especially productive for getting beyond tired binaries, regnant dualisms of an unfettered Cartesianism, whether in natural sciences, social sciences, whether in academy or society at large. So our mind-body, the central trope of Bill's analysis, our mind-body must at once be assumed and yet relentlessly explored through language in order to reach a point on the edge, and this is where it gets dangerous, just beyond the edge of language. So we have to use language to come to the edge, but sometimes just beyond the edge of language. And it's a primordial act of engagement with ourselves, our own lost histories, that is paramount. And one of the things that I was going to describe as Recovering the Ground, I had a quote there, but instead of giving that quote, I want to cite something which I really found even more illuminating than that quote from the letter. This was to David Rutledge back in June of 1988, a Dear David letter, you might call. And at the end of it, when Bill is trying to, I should mention that I had really gone through this, and there was another point when Bill had mentioned something I'd never heard. This is a letter to Milton Scarborough. This is 88, so I should mention this in 1987. Bill's reflection on retirement, which of course hits home to me because we have this in common of having been at Duke for a long time, but actually retiring, Bill obviously taught, as I've taught at other places than Duke, but Bill retired from Duke in 87, and so this is in September 87, so he's just finished his official teaching at Duke that previous summer, and he writes from Greece to Milton Scarborough in September 87, Milton, correct me if I misquoted or miswrote this thing. I am, of course, officially retired, though my new, quotation mark, daily routine is indistinguishable from that of the past 40 years. Really, some retirement. The energy previously focused in teaching this or that class is now directed into 4 hours every morning of hard thinking and the clearest writing of which I am capable. So that's how he engaged retirement. Does that sound right? Okay. So here is what he came out with when he says, apropos of this, I wrote in my blue book. Oh, and he said every morning he wrote in a blue book. Must be the Yale-Duke connection. Everything has to be blue. So I wrote him, it wasn't, red or pink or yellow or white, certainly not black. I wrote in my blue book, the morning after you were here. So obviously they'd had a morning conversation. Well, there's an early reference to Wittgenstein. No, well, actually, no, it's funny you say that because obviously you know much more about Bill's thinking than I do, because the preceding part, which I was going to skip, was his commentary on Wittgenstein Conversations 49 to 51. So I was just going to leave that out because he says, this book gives the best possible picture of the way L.W. went about thinking. I recommend it. And then he goes on to say, apropos of our colloquy, here's what I want to say about etymology, which I wrote in my blue book the morning after you were here.
In my blue book.
In my blue book. That is capital B, my blue book. In my blue book, the morning after you were here, I have discovered from etymology more about my mind and my body, underline mind, underline body, especially about how they derive from and remain grounded in my mind-body, condensed, combined, underlined, than from any other source. Indeed, etymology has been my principal instrument of research. If he wrote this elsewhere, I missed it, but I thought this was just really extraordinary. Etymology has been my principal instrument of research. To follow the history of our language until it disappears into the logos, implicit in our sentence, vitality, and orientation, is to discover that mind is embodied and that bodies enminded. Mind is embodied and that body is enminded. And they are both rooted in the primitive ordinations of our mind bodily energies. That language, our first formal system, has the sinews of our bodies which had them first. That's extraordinary. Language, our first formal system, has the sinews of our bodies which had them first. It is impossible to study the English word tend in its etymological matrix without being drawn mind bodily in the most palpable way into that place where mind and body are one. You remember that? I'm going to remember it too. I think that was, and it's been recorded, so other people are going to remember it. So then Bill wrote in Recovering the Ground, he wrote in August of 1990, in undertaking, and I thought this was a beautiful commentary on what I had found from Recovering the Ground, but said it in a way that I could never have imagined. In undertaking to show the continuity between the primordial ordinations, again this phrase, ordinations, between the primordial ordinations of our lively, sentient, motile, not mobile, but motile, and oriented being on the one hand, so we have sentient, oriented being on one hand, and reflective instruments of our most abstract feats of intellection on the other, I have claimed that language, our first formal system, has the sinews of our bodies that had them first. So this is echoing of that earlier Blue Book. That the grammar, the syntax, the ingenuous choreography, this is the new part. Now it becomes a dance. Before it was kind of exercise, but now it's a dance. The grammar, the syntax, the ingenuous choreography of our rhetorical engagement with the world, the meaning, the semantic and metaphorical intentionalities of our language are preformed in that of our prelingual, mind-bodily being in the world. So I mean, I think there's just, one can feel him working through the lines of what becomes his preoccupation before he retired. But in my estimation, I said it to a couple people last night, I think the reason he wrote so sparingly while he was an active teacher is that the process of teaching for him was an all-consuming process. And that it wasn't teaching, it was receiving. The teaching was as much what he understood. And I have to give a contrast. Stanley Hauerwas and Stanley Fish. Some of you may have heard of one, not the other. But anyway, they both were at Duke. And John you never had Stanley Fish, but you did have Stanley Hauerwas. Right?
I never was a teacher at Fish, but yes.
So Stanley Fish, this is in contrast to Bill Poteat as a teacher, just aside. Stanley Hauerwas and Stanley Fish were one time at an alumnus gathering where they both had to give talks. And Stanley Hauerwas got up and he said various things, which I won't quote because I'm not going to swear in this room. I can put in quotation marks, but it still might sound a little rude. But essentially it was Stanley, right? But then Stanley Fish got up and pressed a button. And I looked at him and said, "What are you pressing the button for?" He said, "I want to record it. It's going to be the only thing worth hearing today." So his mode of teaching was to record what he said and take it home and write it. So I thought, how am I going to give a feeling myself of the opposite tone of Bill as a colleague and teacher and Stanley Fish as somebody who was a colleague and a quasi-teacher. Okay, so it's only, Bill says, by being in touch with our prelingual mind-bodily being in the world that we can avoid and so avert the Cartesian esprit de géométrie that Bill named as the pervasive poison of our time, meaning the time, and here I think R has to be elaborated, the time of European, American, mostly educated folk since the 17th century. Another name for this stalking enemy that Bill uses in Recovering the Ground is scientism. Consider the danger, he concludes, page 152 of Recovering the Ground. If you conclude the nature of absolutely everything, and again he italicizes, absolutely everything, can be understood only as a function of numerical ratios, as with Pythagoreanism. Again, a very geometric, rationally scientific way of thinking. Put this with other premises and soon you have physical sciences, and then you get that all but unassailable derangement. Here, insanity becomes derangement, but it's still the same thing. You get that all but unassailable derangement or insanity of the modern mind wrought by abstraction, ecumenism, and monism, namely scientism. I think this is a critique. Bill then tries to move beyond what he elsewhere calls the theater of reflection, not wrought by Descartes, but perfected by him. And he does so by looking at what he calls metapsychology. This is my favorite anecdote of all the things I've so far read. Again, with apology, I haven't read the paper, so I'm sorry. It's my second favorite, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to read my most favorite one, which comes from the, I think it was to Beth, because it says the Dear Beth letter of October 91. I won't read the whole thing. That's you, right? Okay, but here's my second favorite. It was my favorite until I read the archives yesterday, but here's my near favorite anecdote from Bill. This again is Recovering the Ground. He's looking at metapsychology in the corpus of Freud's writings, and he says, it's at once a world too narrow, abstract, and mortified for us to live in, but we still have it. And to illustrate how this world is both Freud's and not Freud's, the world in which we live, he tells the story of an Armenian graduate student, and I can't identify this person. Maybe somebody here who can, but somebody who was likely a student of Bill's from the 70s or 80s, and maybe you can get him. This is why I think it's so great, Dale's project, to sort of try and get a listing of all the people who had PhDs and wrote dissertations with Bill. I couldn't find this guy, maybe one of you can tell me, but he's a Harvard medical doctor, also trained in psychoanalysis, later completed an MDiv, and the point that Bill makes this narrative come alive in Recovering the Ground, he was working toward a PhD in religion with Bill. So I gather this must have been in the 80s. And the story of this anonymous Armenian-American psychiatrist family is told in a picture of 8 adults hanging on his office walls. All of them had survived Armenian massacres during the First World War. And the picture of them was taken as they gathered in a garden for Sunday afternoon picnic in 1920s Aleppo. And of course, reading this now and what's going on in Syria, you say, wow, less than 100 years ago, Aleppo was really a dangerous spot, and now it's a ruin. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. It was called Halaba. I've actually been given lectures in Arabic in Aleppo, and I can barely imagine what it's like now. But here in the 1920s, it was also a tough spot. The itinerant Armenian-American psychiatrist who's talking to Bill concludes his commentary on the picture on his wall by saying, all this history here happened before I was born. The picture of 1920s Aleppo and the survivors and his family from the Armenian massacres. So what's the point? The point is that what Freudian metapsychology can say in its own strictly observed limits about heights and depths of human reality in the world, brought from the lives and histories of people into the rich texture of this photograph in that time and place, is, valuable though it may be for cultural analysis, even more for psychoanalytic therapy, next to nothing. The deeper reality of it is next to nothing. The lives and histories, notice coming back to history, lives and histories, the so-called weak sciences according to a geometric logic of a post-Cartesian or a reified Cartesian world. The lives and histories, their meaning to themselves, to one another, the meaning for the world of just these 8 people are too complex, too rich to be understood, to be participated in terms of Freudian categories alone. I thought this was just an extraordinary anecdote revealing Bill's preoccupation with getting beyond the seeming value or understanding of something and looking deeper into the contours, relevance of the context. And then he goes on to talk about things I've already mentioned, the 3 elements of scientism, abstraction, ecumenism, ontological monism. You've already heard about that. You're going to hear more about it. Let me skip all those isms. And just say that this story points away beyond the shadows of despair, but it also opens a path out of the tunnel marked as Gnostic apocalypticism. That is a kind of alienation from ourselves which Bill sees as a self-inflicted nihilism, one that he strives to excise, even exorcise from himself as from others. And this ray of hope comes from, in my view, the both-and logic of the narrative offered by that Armenian-American psychiatrist turned religionist. Like others who followed mathematical sciences and went beyond them. So this is interesting. Many of the people who, and we've heard Ray talk about it, including Polanyi, who become exponents of a deeper, less rational knowledge or a more subtle form of rationality, include Polanyi. Toulmin was a scientist. Wittgenstein, obviously a mathematician before he became philosopher. And Bill Student, the psychiatrist, who then becomes a student of religion. So many people, and I have to say on a personal note, I was into astrophysics before I turned to languages and then got into this funny thing called religion. So there's a certain way in which you're looking for some answer in the sciences, and you may even be very good at tracking those evidences and traces and opportunities, vistas through science, but at some point you come to an end or a turn in the road where science doesn't give the answer. So Bill Student is not proposing, nor would I, nor do I think Polanyi or Toulmin or Wittgenstein, propose to eliminate science, but to recover the ground, hence the title, recover the ground preceding, undergirding all true science. So it's not eliminating science. It's not being anti-scientific. It's not going back to wagons and wheels. The Armenian-American psychiatrist does not say, I'm giving up psychiatry or becoming a theology professor. He knows that the deeply layered meaning of his family's Levantine history can neither be understood nor participated in, the key word term, participated in through categories provided by Freud alone. It's the limits as well as the benefits of Freudian metapsychology that need to be observed. So then again, to just end with Bill and what he sees as the necessity to kind of understand the mind-body. And I summarize it this way, and then I want to read this lovely thing from Beth, not the whole thing, but just some parts of this, because I think it's a more fitting ending to my paper than the one that I wrote here. So Bill, as I said earlier, one of the phrases he uses in Recovering the Ground, he wants to uncover less explicit rational powers, less explicit rational powers. So his goal is not to destroy or deny reason, but to probe its frontiers, internal and sentient as much as external and visual. The very conjunction of Bill's key term, mind-body, expresses for me the paradox he seeks. There's no hyphen. It's not mind-body. It's not two parts conjoined, but one phenomenon, a single existent mind-body. So the flow of energy is signaled by the order of the two parts. Mind is in sync with body. There is no mind or mental act without a body or bodily counterpart. No thought without its physical, reflex, or catalyst. So the physical can be the catalyst and not just the reflex of the mind. The two as one, mind, body, are not identical. He's not merging mind, body, and mind. Just says each has its own function at the same time that neither surrenders to nor is merged with the other. Now, I had a lot about Kierkegaard I was going to quote, and I had some other things about Barzakh, which is into my fantasy world called Islamic studies. But instead of going there, I want to just read this thing, which I think for me summarizes from a blue notebook the way Bill thought about the academy. And when I read this yesterday, I said, not only is this something which echoes Bill, but even in the way it's written, it reminds me of Bill. So you have this thing here, and then you have the corrections on the side. So you have the letter written like this. Do you remember that? And all the things on the side. And then when he gets further into the argument, he has a real big thing on the side. And then when he gets to the end, he says, oh, and by the way, here's the additional paragraph. Okay. So all of you are familiar with this way of thinking. I'm going to try and see if I can read this without totally cracking up. Actually, it got reshuffled even in my doing it. So let me make sure I don't lose the pages here. Okay. So it starts out, and Beth, correct me if I do misread or otherwise get it wrong. It's October 25th, 1991, and it's Nantucket Island, and it's a Dear Beth letter. Dear Beth, I was happily marinating in my own sweat. What a lovely opening line. Do you have the image? I was happily marinating in my own sweat. Stretched out semi-comatose in a chaise lounge, a copy of Updike's Rabbit at Rest open. Rabbit at Rest open. I mean, just, the way in which that unfolds what he's going to say. Pages down, on my belly, when I heard the postman stop, slam the mailbox shut, and drive off. The noise awoke me from my lazy dreaming and snoozing. The contents of your letter awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers. You can feel the mind-body shifting gears here. I have, of course, and now this is the part for those of you who have been in this, can we call it cockpit, of the academic study of religion in the 20th and now 21st century. He reports, and I could give you a chapter and verse of the report on which he's talking about, but that's really irrelevant. What's really, to me, relevant and fascinating is Bill's response to it. I have, of course, not read the AAR, that's the American Academy of Religion report, from which your discussion took its lead. But on the basis of the two snippets your letter supplies, that is to say, the religious studies departments have matured, in quotation marks, to this wonderful pluralism, he's being sarcastic, and securing conviction is not an objective of the academic study of religion, quote unquote. I could, if I had nothing better to do with my life, invent, underlined, the whole report down to details, though I fear that as I tried to force the words of this fatuous, complacent document onto the page, I would be seized by an attack of retching that might well prove fatal. I had a sense he didn't like it. And then he goes on to say, to be perhaps unduly pessimistic and to find a point upon it, only when you have read and been appropriated by, that's such wonderful, when you've read and been appropriated by Polanyi meditations, have you been prepared to see, underline, your colloquy for what it is, a conversation among amiable lunatics, trying in concepts that have hardly anything to do with reality, rather than desperately trying to find their way to its bedrock. Amiable lunatics. So at a certain, this describes many people in the study of religion, maybe most. At a certain level of reflection, a contemporary academic is likely to imagine his field, quote unquote, as a sum of all the data and its interpretation that are contained in all the books that constitute the bibliography of his field. It will vary somewhat from discipline to discipline, but in a far more pernicious sense, as he depicts himself standing outside all of these books as if arranged on a shelf opposite his detached gaze, he will imagine himself standing outside the whole of his field as one gigantic text in which it is contained and to which his relation is as impersonal as that he has to a printed page before him. In other words, it's not very subjective. He will in practice have read these books, inwardly marked and digested them. That playful rhetoric, for those of you who aren't Episcopalians, some of the Episcopalians, that sounds like something I read in the Book of Common Prayer. This is Bill's Episcopal mentoring coming through in this. Inwardly mark, learn, inwardly digest. So here, inwardly marked and digested them, made their perspective upon things so much a part of his underlying perspective upon and his very way of being underlying amidst things that he's usually at a loss to identify extrinsic sources of his own thought. Notwithstanding, however, when he thinks of his field and of his relation to it, of detachment of himself as a spectator, having a merely aesthetic appreciation, he wants to move into another mode of being. And then he goes on to talk about how this involves a second language, the ignoring of this second language. And so then at the end of it he says, now of course these amiable lunatics who said securing is not an objective of the academic study of religion, what they have ignored is notional assent a la your uncle. Is it your uncle? I'm trying to see why he called John Henry Newman your uncle.
Oh, because my last name's Newman. I think
Oh, there he goes.
Yeah.
So, okay, by association, since your last name is Newman, John Henry's your uncle.
Yeah, right.
So this is a random association that Bill is very capable of doing. So the notional assent a la your uncle, John Henry Newman, as if practicing religion or science were first following an explicit body of doctrines, our fidelity to which, our liturgical embodiment which are exhausted by catechizing, we must instead undertake to induce the personal appropriation. This is, I think, his accent throughout all his work. We must undertake to induce the personal appropriation of what students learn, whatever this may be, to assist them to take up an ethical rather than a merely aesthetical relation to what they come to know, to enable them to make what is learned, whatever it may be, become a part of the texture of each one's unique grip upon the meaning and value, and this is where he becomes very gender inclusive. He's obviously writing to Beth. Each one's unique grip upon the meaning and value of his or her existence in the world in which he or she will live and from which he or she will one day die. And then he says, see over for insert. I want to end with the insert. And how do we make ourselves into the kind of teachers with whom it's possible for students to accomplish this for themselves? By assuming an ethical relationship to ourselves before them. So the mode of teaching that gets beyond this mechanical listing and trying to figure out whether you're pluralist and how you relate to lists of bibliography, get beyond this, assuming an ethical relationship to ourselves before our students, in front of them it is, by taking them seriously as men and women who can and must assume responsibility for themselves and their thought, by forcing them to be accountable for their words and deeds. And then he says, P.S. Thanks for the picture of the Dirty Dozen of Friday afternoons. Your bright, brightly smile at the center lends class to this congregation of street people. Thanks, too, for the interesting postmortem on your Eucharist paper. So I think I will end at that and just say that it's been an extraordinary pleasure for me to go through this effort to even begin to grapple with piebald legacy of Bill Poteat. And I look forward very much to hearing and enjoying what the rest of you are going to say.